40% Merlot, 40% Malbec, and 20% Cab Sauv.
It's good for you. It's not that good.
Welcome to the Wine Enthusiast podcast. The world in your glass.
Hi, I'm Susan Kostrzewa. I'm the executive editor of Wine Enthusiast. In today's episode, we'll be talking to Jordan Salcito, who's the beverage director of Momofuku Group, Brandon O'Daniel, who's the head distiller out of Louisville, Kentucky, and a few of us as well, talking about how we fell in love with wine, beer, and spirits.
Hi, I'm Jameson Fink. I'm the senior digital editor for Wine Enthusiast.
How did you get into wine?
I'd have to say that wine coolers were my entry into the world of wine. I remember the commercials more than the wine coolers. I remember the two Bartles and James guys.
Thank you for your support.
And Bruce Willis doing the Seagram's Golden Wine Cooler.
His wet and his dry, golden wine cooler. My, golden wine cooler.
It's always songs like that stay in your mind, but, you know, the good ones you can't remember. I guess they did their job properly.
They did. I still remember them 20-some-odd years later.
So mine was also wine coolers. I had older siblings who were, you know, obviously drinking legally, but there was stuff around the house, and Bartles and James were probably one of the first things I ever tried. So I don't know if that deterred me or got me into wine, but at least I eventually ended up drinking really good stuff. So
I think the fact that also the wine coolers, I mean, they came in like beer bottles, more or less, like 12-ounce bottles, made a difference. That
Right.
It was sort of like, oh, it's just like a beer or something. There wasn't like a corkscrew involved or any sort of, you know, machinations or technical skills. Like, open it and drink it.
it wasn't supposed to be fussy. I don't think it was supposed to be. I mean, obviously from flavor perspective, but also just, yeah, exactly the way that it was marketed. But it also, I think, reflected kind of where the country was at the time in wine. I mean, it wasn't a super sophisticated market for wine yet. So even if they had been pushing like higher end, like you say, you know, more elegantly packaged stuff, it probably wouldn't have, you know, sort of resonated with the public in the way that something like that did. I don't know. And it's interesting that now there's like a new sort of take on wine coolers. It'll be interesting to see how they do given the current market.
And now I'd like to drink a wine cooler, but I just make it myself. I just get some white wine or rosé, some ice, maybe some club soda, a little fruit, like a, you know, sangria type thing.
Right.
Now my idea of a wine cooler has a whole different connotation rather than something.
That's a good point. I mean, if you think about, this is a little off of the wine cooler topic, but like even cocktails, you know, I was in Italy last year and I was drinking a lot of Campari and soda, and, you know, there's just certain, I don't know, I felt very adult doing that, but there's different combinations of beverages that you can drink that are great, and wine is included in that. It doesn't have to be a spirit. You can kind of play around with wine. I mean, it just depends on what you want your experience to be, what the wine is, and what the situation is, I guess.
My name is Joe Czerwinski, managing editor of Wine Enthusiast magazine. In our house growing up, wine was pretty much just a special occasion thing. So we'd have like a Liebfraumilch or Chianti around the holidays. But what was big was food. My grandmother was a big foodie and was part of like these single gourmet clubs and things like that. So she always knew what the cool restaurants were. And since we're talking a while back in the 70s, all the cool restaurants were French. And I guess because I identified strongly with French food, wine came along with that. So when I started doing my own cooking, I started to cook classic French dishes, and they always used wine. That's how I got into wine.
So after we started with wine coolers, what was like the first time you started drinking wine and you were like, I'm kind of like figuring it out, or like, this is what I like?
College, for sure.
Uh-huh.
So I was just remembering, like, we had this great apartment in Evanston. I remember I shared it with like 4 other girls. It was kind of chaotic. But we had this really cool sunroom in the front of this apartment, and we used to throw dinner parties in there. I mean, as much as we knew what that meant at, you know, young age, but we were trying. And I just remember we were buying wine, but I think it was, and I'm going to mispronounce, is it vendange?
Oh, yeah, vendage.
Vendage. I'm giving it a French pronunciation to try to elevate it. Well, anyway, we would get like large format of vendage, but it was just like more for us to drink. So like that was my entry level. And what I do remember, regardless of whether the wine itself was great, was just how much fun it was to sit around a table, have a meal, and drink wine.
Yeah,
so what about you?
My first thing was college, where I was cooking dinner with some of my friends. And for some reason, I don't know, I think I must have had, I'm sure I had like the wine Bible. There's something about Gewürztraminer with a little bit of, sometimes it has a little bit of sweetness too, and it's just a very lush wine, and it can be nice with spicy foods. And I was like, I don't know. So I bought a bottle of it. Ended up being great. But then when I went to Chicago, when I moved from Chicago from this college I went to in Iowa, I had like a job where I had a salary, and I was like, I can buy wine, I can spend money on wine. I would go to my little bodega, which I thought had a great wine selection because they had more than like 5 bottles. They actually had like racking in there, and I was like, ooh, racking, wooden
that
racks.
Must mean it's good.
Yeah, and I remember buying, the 2 brands I remember buying were Meridian Chardonnay and Ravenswood Zinfandel.
Oh yeah, Ravenswood was a good, really good. I don't want to call it entry level because I actually do like Ravenswood a lot, but that was one of mine as well that really got me into wine. I could totally get it. It was affordable.
The packaging was cool.
It was cool packaging, yeah. No, that's definitely true. Did you, I think a lot of times people who are first getting into wine tend to gravitate towards sweet. So it was interesting that you said, you were drinking Gewürztraminer, which obviously good Gewürztraminer doesn't have that. It's very balanced. But I remember I lived in California for a while, and that's really where I got into wine. Living there, obviously. But one of the wines I loved at the time, like when I was first getting into wine, was called 1,000 Flowers by a winery called Hop Kiln.
Oh, yeah, sure. I remember that wine.
Yeah. It had a really pretty label.
Yes, it did.
But I definitely started with like a sweeter palate, then kind of moved away. But now I'm rediscovering all the great sweet wines of the world because, obviously balance is a huge part of it. It's like, great minerality and all that stuff. But did you start? You were talking about some of the wines.
Well, I'm sure Meridian Chardonnay probably had some sweetness in it, even though it wasn't labeled as such. But no, actually, I always thought that when I started drinking wine, I always thought that wine was like, it's kind of like that first sip of beer you have, like it was my dad's old style. And I was like, this is awful. This is so harsh. And then I can't understand how people would drink it and be like, The thing with wine was I always thought it had to be like strong and harsh, and like that was wine. It's like big and rich and bold and like powerfully tannic. I guess my idea of wine would be something like every wine is like a massive Cabernet, and you need to wait for 20 years.
A lot of what was around.
Maybe it's like coffee. You have to. And I'm saying put cream and sugar in my wine, but you kind of start a little bit sweet, and then once you get sort of a feel for it, like with coffee, I started backing off on the cream and sugar.
Mm-hmm. I think it's your palate, and it's also the quality of what you're drinking. So, like, it's definitely you start to get more of a taste for nuances in like coffee, but also you start to get smarter about what type of coffee you're buying.
Right.
Coffee's a good example of something similar to wine. It's like if it's good, if the grapes are good, if the coffee's good, you don't need much to add much to it. Not much needs to be done. It's just good on its own.
Carrie Dykes, tasting coordinator for Wine Enthusiast magazine. My first experience with wine would be somehow acquiring a Boone's Farm strawberry flavored, opening it, having a little bit, putting it in my closet to hide from my parents, revisiting it a month later with my friend when they went out, not realizing that wine turns, immediately getting so sick. I said to myself, I will never do this again, and here I am today.
Hi, I'm Marina, Vataj, digital managing editor of Wine Enthusiast magazine. My dad used to make like underground wine in the basement, and he carved out the cellar, which was like so cool. And he would just every night we would go down to the cellar and get another bottle, and he'd open it, and we'd be having like massive chunks of lamb and fresh made bread and cheese, and he'd just pop open the bottle, and we would just all drink. I was in my teens, and I have like a little bit here and there, but it was never this like thing that was taboo. It was always like something you did at the dinner table with your family. And it just so happened my dad's wine was at the time really, really great. Since then, I've had other wines that probably make his not sound great. But yeah, it it was just part of my dinner table tradition, having my dad's homemade wine.
And it's Senior Digital Editor Jameson Fink. I'm speaking with Jordan Salcito. She's the beverage director of the Momofuku Group. I wonder if you could tell me what Bellus Wines is.
Of course. Okay, so Bellus is a company that I founded in 2011, and really my entry point to wine was, aside from drinking actually decent wine with my parents, when we'd get like a sip here and there, but in college. So I went to a college, and Natty Light was the beer of choice, and every party had Natty Light, and I am not somebody who enjoys that. So by the time I was a junior, and I'd lived in Italy by this point, my junior year, you had like Chianti and cheap Prosecco, but I got back to college and was sort of like, all right, I don't have to deal with Natty Light anymore. I'm drinking wine. Franzia, that's my entry point. So I drank Franzia Rosé probably my entire senior year, and that was a great entry point into wine. I felt like that's very accessible, and that was like way more delicious than Natty Light in my opinion. But then very soon after, a couple years later, when I started working harvest in Burgundy and got really seriously into this world of wine in a sort of more focused way, the wineries that I was lucky enough to work at were Domaine du Jacques, Domaine Comte Lafon, Domaine de Monty, Domaine de Larlot. These were wines that were certainly above my price point, so I could drink them because I was in the industry. But what about all of my friends who were sort of saying, hey, what wine should I drink? And I can't be like, oh, go get a bottle of Latage, it's really delicious. And I felt like there was this sort of void in the market at the time for wines that were made with exactly the same integrity, so minimal intervention, organic farming, and just meant to taste like the place where they were from. And I felt like that sort of message was missing from this world of wine that people who are not in our industry had access to. And so that was how Bellus started.
Well, and then just tell me what else you're working on that's new and exciting.
Okay, so the thing I'm super, super excited about is Ramona Fizz. So Ramona, I also, in addition to Franzia, in college, I really loved the wine cooler. The wine cooler was like way too sweet. I mean, in retrospect now that I've, gone through the Court of Master Sommeliers and all that, would I drink a wine cooler today the same wine cooler I drank 10 years ago?
The Bartles and James, the Seagrams.
Probably not, but I feel like it is due for an upgrade, and it's due for a refresh, and they actually disappeared sort of in the late 90s because of an excise tax that Congress passed in 1991 that made it much more favorable to use malt liquor as a base for any of these products. So that's where you're like, Zima sprang up, and your Smirnoff Ice, and all of those are malt liquor based instead of wine, and I prefer to drink wine, and why not make an organic one? So we are using some organic grapes from Italy, and it's actually less of a carbon footprint to ship wine over from Italy to New York than it would be to ship them from like on truck from Oregon or from wherever over to where we are, and we're going to blend it with some grapefruit, and we are going to release the first that I believe it's the first organic wine cooler, and it will be served in a 250 milliliter slim can, which is like the size, think of like a Red Bull can, so it's like that size, and I'm really excited about it. We worked a lot, it started with experiments in the kitchen and sort of fresh grapefruit juice here and this wine versus that wine and my little carbonation machine, which totally got ruined in the process. But so that will launch this year, and we're excited.
Well, Jordan, thanks for your perspective on restaurant wine lists and wine coolers and big boxed wines, and really and accessible wines made in the manner that some of the best wines are, but at more affordable prices. And I just want to say, if people want to follow you on Instagram, you're at Jordan Salcito, Salcito, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this group of people, and an honor to be having this conversation today. Thank you.
And we'll enjoy some Hershey's miniatures now.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will.
Okay, so Jameson, now that you have the worldly perspective that you have, what would you tell somebody who is sort of maybe new to wine and maybe just right now, or they're just drinking wine coolers, but they kind of want to move to the next level? And what would you say would be good advice for them?
I think, a particular wine I would suggest would be Vino Verde. And although it's a large, broad category with a wide spectrum of wines, but there's a lot of welcoming, friendly, inexpensive. It's from Portugal. It's a white wine, and it's got a little spritz to it. So it's low alcohol too. So it's not. It's just really fresh and fun, and I think it's a nice introduction into the world of white wines, transitioning from something like a wine cooler or like a malt/wine beverage. So, Susan, you talked to a distiller whose initial foray into the world of beverage making wasn't in spirits. Tell me how he got his start.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. He started out as a winemaker, and then through his interest in wine, got into distilling. And he had gained a lot of perspective from his time in wine that he applied to spirits. This is Susan Kostrzewa, executive editor, and I'm here with Brandon O'Daniel, who's the head distiller at Copper & Kings American Brandy Company in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So, Brandon, you're doing some really interesting things at Copper & Kings, and one of the things I wanted to talk about was your lavender-infused absinthe and some of your offbeat brandy bottlings.
Absinthe was originally made with fruit. Brandy is definitely a fruit-derived spirit. So when we got back flipping into the history books and we saw how absinthe used to be made, it was a natural fit for us to get into the absinthe market and make it with grapes versus GNS.
It's interesting, too, because now all of these changes in the way that the American public experiments with what they're eating and drinking, the timing seems right for these things, even though, like you say, these are actually a nod to the tradition. What are you seeing as far as people trying new spirits? You see a change in the way that people are approaching these sort of fun approaches?
Well, I think I'm seeing a change in general with people going from a lot of processed, big manufactured products to more of a craft handmade product. And then especially when you start linking it back into our forefathers and what we were doing before that, it just it tugs on that heartstring, with the American people to get back to their roots, so to speak, that is really in the last, few decades has kind of been lost.
When you look at American history and culture, spirits are part of our DNA. Going back for so long, there are these great recipes. Some of them are resurging. And can you talk to me a little bit about your interest in the history of spirits in the U.S.? I mean, how much of that are you researching as you're going into these new projects?
The history aspect of it is absolutely huge. So at Copper & Kings, we're history buffs, at least with alcohol, above everything else. And really kind of flip through and see how alcohol used to be made before we were all worshiping that bottom dollar or that high dollar, however you want to see it. It kind of always sparked an interest in me. I mean, when I got the opportunity to make spirits in a traditional sense, all done by hand, and I start from start to finish with the grapes and we go all the way to the barrel, it was just something that kind of struck in me that, seemed important.
So there's a trend right now in home distilling. Again, actually, if you look to history, it's something that's been done for a long time in the U.S., but I'm based in New York, and we always talk about in Brooklyn, you pretty much can find somebody distilling something in their apartment at some point. What do you think about this? I mean, do you support it? What's your feeling about that?
It's a kind of a mixed bag. So I'm from Kentucky, and home distilling is a huge deal down there. There is no doubt about it. And some of the finest spirits I've ever had have come out of mason jars. That being said, there are a lot of people that are getting interested in it, but don't necessarily know the safety aspects of it. And that's kind of my main concern. I would hate to have any of my friends go blind because they drank something that they weren't supposed to, made by somebody that didn't know how to do the cuts and didn't know how to do the fermentation. So it's extremely fun, and I'll be lying to you if I said I didn't get started on a small little 5-gallon pot still. But at the same time, it's nice to know what you're drinking.
Overall, talk to me a little bit about trends in distilling and trends in spirits that you're seeing that are exciting to you, and that either you're looking at doing Copper & Kings, or just overall in the industry that you're seeing that you want to try or see more of.
Well, there's two sides of that. Again, we're going back to the originality thing, pre-prohibition cocktails, pre-prohibition spirits, pre-prohibition stills, even to speak. And then at the same time, you're seeing another trend on the exact opposite, where they're doing very modern stuff, very high science, very low loss. So both of them interest me as far as the science aspect of it. When it comes to art and actually lifestyle and how I like to live mine, I'm all about doing everything by taste. It's old style or old school or nothing for me.
Talk to me a little bit about your process when you're coming up with a new product like that. Does it come from an inspiration? How do you create something, and what is your process?
So that's really the cool thing about Copper and King. So even though we're really in several states, we're in 24 at the moment, we're still a very small company. So really what happens is we do a lot of brainstorming. So it'll be myself, the bosses, and a few other employees. We'll sit down, we'll throw back and spitball, ideas back and forth. When a few of us decide that's where we want to go, I'll then go downstairs and I have a 50-gallon pot still named Sarah. And she allows me to basically get as creative as I want to. It's a whole lot easier to dump 50 gallons worth of wash if it doesn't turn out versus 750, which is one of my other style pots. So that's really where it starts. We're just basically sitting around over lunch or over cocktails, coming up with either new ideas or reinventing classics. And then from there, it's kind of up to me to go downstairs and let's see if I can actually make that come together, connect the dots.
Am I correct that you have a winemaking background?
I do.
Okay, so this is interesting to me because I always wonder about the crossover, not only in just in the styles, but the process. I mean, how do you feel that your winemaking background informed or influenced what you're doing now?
My winemaking background was definitely the foundation for my entire career. I fell in love with the grapevine before I even fell in love with alcohol. I was a vineyard manager well before I was a winemaker. And when I got started, I wanted to stay in the vineyard completely. From there, the wine kind of crept in, and I got really into that. The distilling aspect of it was just really icing on the cake. But as far as connection, they are all one and the same. I really find, or at least I guess believe, so to speak, that in order to be a true vintner or winemaker or distiller, you've got to do all of them. So starting in the vineyard, a good bottle of wine is made in the vineyard. There's no doubt about it, and everybody says that. But at the same time, a fantastic bottle of brandy is also made in the vineyard. So if you don't know the structures of the vines, the soil, the weather conditions, it's really hard to miss that gap and then still produce a really nice brandy at the end, because there's a tremendous amount of steps between vineyard A and brandy still Z. So starting at the base and getting my hands dirty for several years before I even got into the winery side of things, I think really gave me a foundation that allows me to sit here and have a little bit of confidence about what I say and about what I want to go with as far as my choices throughout this career.
And cocktails. Talk to me a little bit about cocktails in general and some of your favorites and some of the cocktails that you think people should be paying attention to.
So I kind of have a different approach about cocktails. So my philosophy on cocktails is the original cocktail was to hide or kind of knock off some of the bite of that spirit. After working at Copper and Kings and really being able to taste a tremendous amount of different, at least variations of spirit, my cocktail preferences seem to be leaning towards let's promote that spirit and let's showcase that spirit. So I like a cocktail that when you taste it and you smell it, you can actually tell what that base spirit is. So my favorite cocktail, is an old fashioned. Actually, my new favorite is actually one that we do at Copper and Kings. It's called the C&K Express, and that's basically a couple ice cubes, a couple shots of brandy, and then just a little bit of citrus peel. I try to stay as simple as possible. I like a good 9-7 part cocktail. There's no doubt about it. It's an art form to make those. That being said, after 12 hours watching the still and you want something to drink, it's nice to be able to pull out 2 to 4 ingredients and still make a cocktail, and then be able to taste the spirit that you made that day or 5 years ago, whatever it may be. So I'm kind of more on the pre-prohibition style, a little bit on the heady side for alcohol, a little light on the sweetness, but to each their own.
And I really like the idea of, I think that obviously trends, there are cycles, and I think that right now everyone's really enjoying the more simple approach to cocktails, and I think you're right, because we have access to such better spirits now, and I think people are more knowledgeable about those spirits. What do you think has been the change in the American understanding of spirits over the last, say, 10 years? I mean, do you see people becoming more and more discerning and knowledgeable about the spirits they're drinking and expecting more than they used to?
Without a doubt. And really, I think that all relates back to the farm-to-table movement, the small farm agricultural movement. Spirits is agriculture. There's no doubt about it. Whether you're making fruit brandies or you're making grain spirits, it all starts out at the farm. And I think people are really starting to miss and notice they no longer have that connection to where their food comes from. So I think once they bridge that gap and they figure out, oh my goodness, that tomato that I got from my neighbor down the road was so much better than the grocery store tomato, they start asking more questions. And then what else is better when it's handcrafted? And what else is better when the guy down the road is doing it? And it was just a natural progression from food to beer to spirits. It's just kind of how we go as Americans.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing that we're rediscovering that side of being connected to the food that we drink, or food that we eat, and everything we drink. It's a great evolution for us. Brandon, thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to see what you come up with next.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
This podcast is produced by Large Media, L-A-R-J Media. Wine Enthusiast is made possible by grapes, sunshine, and wine, and by the hard-working editors who bring you news and information on your favorite beverage every day. If you like what we're doing, share our podcast with your friends and give us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For more fun wine information, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Wine Enthusiast.